Hello viewers, welcome to my channel. Okay, so let's dive into this topic about Rachel Reeves and the anticipated stealth freeze on income tax thresholds, right? What's happening here is quite significant in terms of economic policy. Rachel Reeves, who's the shadow chancellor for the Labour Party, is expected to extend this freeze on income tax thresholds past 2028. Yeah, the Conservative government initially set that deadline, but now Labour is looking at pushing it even further. So what does this mean in practical terms? Well, when we talk about a freeze on income tax thresholds, we're basically saying that the points at which people move into higher tax bands won't adjust for inflation. Sounds simple enough, right? But here's where it gets tricky. As wages increase over time, and hopefully they do, at least to keep pace with inflation, more and more people will find themselves bumped into higher tax brackets. This is what's called fiscal drag, and it's a sneaky way of increasing the amount of tax people pay without actually raising the official tax rates. You might be earning more, but your tax-free allowance doesn't go up to match inflation, so more of your income gets taxed. I see, that's how it works. So why is Reeves considering this? Well, it comes down to a PS40 billion gap in public finances that Labour argues was created by the Conservatives. Yeah, they're inheriting a pretty tough financial situation. The challenge for Labour is how to raise that kind of money without blatantly breaking their promises. Remember, during the last election, Labour pledged not to raise taxes on working people. That means no increases in income tax, national insurance, or VAT. So the question is, can this freeze be considered a breach of that promise? The Conservatives are already jumping on this, claiming it could be seen as exactly that. That's a tough spot for Labour, isn't it? Yeah, okay, so Reeves has a few options on the table. The extension of the freeze on income tax thresholds could raise around PS7 billion a year beyond 2028. That's quite a chunk of change. But Labour can't rely on this alone, so they're looking at other tax-raising measures as well. One idea being floated is a crackdown on non-doms. These are people who live in the UK but claim their primary home is abroad, which means they don't pay tax on income earned outside the UK. Labour had previously suggested that tightening these rules could bring in significant revenue, but the Treasury is apparently not convinced that it would generate as much as hoped. Right? That's another potential problem. Now, beyond income tax thresholds, Reeves might also be eyeing inheritance tax. I see the idea here is that by raising inheritance tax, the government could bring in more revenue from wealthy estates. Inheritance tax can be a politically tricky issue because it mainly affects wealthier individuals, but no one likes the idea of the government taking a larger chunk of their family's wealth after death. However, if Labour frames this as a way to address inequality, they might be able to sell it to the public. Right? There's also some talk about a potential increase in capital gains tax. But crucially, it seems like Reeves is considering limiting this to gains from shares rather than from the sale of second homes. Okay, that's a bit more targeted, and it may help Labour avoid the backlash that could come from increasing taxes on property sales, which would hit a broader section of society. But there's more going on here than just tax freezes and hikes. Reeves is also expected to make changes to Labour's fiscal rules. Okay, so what does that mean? Fiscal rules are essentially the guidelines a government sets to manage public finances responsibly. They often include limits on borrowing and debt, and they can affect how much room the government has to spend on things like infrastructure projects. By changing these rules, Reeves could create more borrowing headroom, meaning the government would have more flexibility to borrow for long-term investments without breaking its own guidelines. Right, what's interesting here is that while Reeves and Labour are looking for ways to raise revenue, they're also focused on investment. They've made it clear that they want to fund major infrastructure projects, and these changes to fiscal rules could be key to unlocking the funds needed for that. Yeah, it's about balancing the need for immediate revenue with the longer-term goal of rebuilding and modernizing the country. I see it's a tricky balancing act. Labour leader Keir Starmer, when pressed on these issues, has been careful not to reveal too much before the official budget announcement on October 30th. Yeah, he's keeping things under wraps for now, which is understandable given the complexity and sensitivity of the decisions Labour faces. When asked whether the freeze would violate Labour's manifesto promises, Starmer simply reiterated that Labour intends to keep its pledges, but he also emphasized that this budget will be focused on fixing the foundations and rebuilding the country. Right, that's a broad statement, but it suggests that Labour sees this budget as more than just a set of short-term fixes. They're thinking bigger, aiming for structural changes. But let's circle back to this concept of fiscal drag because it's central to what's going on here. Yeah, this isn't a new strategy. In fact, the current freeze was first introduced by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor and then extended by Jeremy Hunt, his successor. Labour is considering following the same path because, frankly, it's a relatively quiet way to raise significant revenue without the headline-grabbing drama of a tax hike. People may grumble about paying more tax, but because it's tied to inflation and wage increases, it doesn't feel as immediately painful as a sudden rise in tax rates. But there's definitely a downside. The freeze on income tax thresholds means that people who are already feeling the pinch from rising living costs could end up paying more tax, even if their real incomes aren't increasing much in terms of purchasing power. So, while it might be politically easier to sell than a straightforward tax increase, it could still hurt ordinary workers, the very people Labour promised not to tax more. That's where the political risk lies for Reeves and Starmer. So, what's next? Well, we'll find out more when the budget is unveiled at the end of the month. But from what we've heard so far, it's clear that Labour is trying to navigate a very challenging fiscal environment. They need to raise billions to close the gap in public finances and fund their spending plans, but they're also committed to sticking to their manifesto promises not to raise taxes on working people. Yeah, that's no small task. Reeves has a few tools at her disposal, but each one comes with its own risks and trade-offs. The freeze on income tax thresholds is a major piece of the puzzle, but whether or not it ends up being extended past 2028 and how that decision is received by the public will be a key factor in shaping the political landscape going forward. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.